In this lecture, we're going to discuss an advanced extension of the adjective, the participle. We're going to work on the concept of the participle, and we'll learn the forms of one kind, the present participle. This lecture is divided into three parts. Part number one will discuss what a participle is. In part number two, we'll see how a participle is formed in Greek. And in part three, we'll review the endings of the present participle. In thinking about participles, I like to remember them as mermaids. Just like a mermaid is half fish and half human, a participle is half adjective and half verb. And just like a mermaid lives in the sea and acts more like a fish, a participle acts mostly like an adjective. When we think about English, these participles are our ing words. To form the participle in English, we take a verb and we add ing to it. The verb run becomes running. And just as we could use the adjective in the attributive and the predicate use, we can do the same thing with the participle, because it is at heart an adjective. So we can say, the running dog, this is the attributive use, and that can be both the subject, the running dog caught a rabbit, or the object, the rabbit caught the running dog. In the same way, we can use the participle in the predicate to form what we call the continuous tense of the English present verb. The dog is running. With those basics of the participle down, we need to look at the attributes of the participle in Greek. And just as I said, it gets some parts from the adjective and some parts from the verb. From the adjective, it gets gender, case, and number. From the verb, it gets tense and voice. And in part two, we're going to look at each of those aspects. Because we've gone over gender, case, and number several times over the last couple of weeks, I'll start with the verbal aspects of the participle. So first of all, we have tense. Tense, just like with the verb, describes when the participle is happening. But we have a slight complication. It describes when the participle is happening relative to the main verb. What that means is, if the main verb is in the present tense, the participle also happens in the present. If the main verb is in the past, the participle also happens in the past, etc., etc. Perhaps an example sentence will make this clearer. The running dog catches the ball. Because catches, the main verb, is present, the running dog also happens in the present. However, if we change the main verb to the past, the running dog caught the ball, the running dog happens in the past along with the main verb. The second verbal aspect, voice, describes how the participle is happening. And specifically, it describes how the action of the participle relates to the noun. We have three possibilities: active, passive, and middle. In the active, the noun does the action. The running dog. The dog is the one doing the running. In the passive, the action happens to the noun. The carried dog, or as we'd probably say, the dog who is being carried. The action is happening to the dog. The middle doesn't exist in English. It is a peculiarly Greek phenomenon, and because of that, it's very hard to translate. That said, the basic idea is that the noun does the action to or for itself. And as we look at some Greek examples, I hope that the middle will become a little bit clearer. But do know, because we don't have it in English, it really is hard to get your brain around at first. This brings us to part 3, which is looking at the way that the present participle looks in Greek. It's important to know that it has two sets of endings. It has an ending for the present active participle, and then the present middle and passive participles share a set of endings. The good news is the endings are the same as the adjective. The stem in this case comes from whatever verb that we're working with. The example here will be from the verb lego, which means to speak. And the stem is the part before the last vowel, leg, lambda, epsilon, gamma. Like those peculiar adjectives hes, mia, hen, and pas, pasa, pan, the present active participle has third declension endings for the masculine and the neuter gender, and first declension endings in the feminine. To make our present active participle, we take our stem and add our endings, and we'll see the endings on the next slide. Please take a moment to look through this chart and start to familiarize yourself with these endings. We've seen them all before. We've seen them in the first, second, and third declension noun, and in the first, second, and third declension adjective, and to some degree in the definite article. Right now, take some time to see how the masculine and the neuter are the same, and where they differ, and how the feminine is built on a totally different set of endings, that of the first declension, instead of the third like the masculine and neuter. As I said before, the middle and passive participle in the present are identical. And luckily we don't have the same situation as in the present active. Instead, both of them use the first and second declension endings for the masculine, the feminine, and the neuter. We have to make a slight change to make the present middle passive participle. We take the stem, we then add this insertion men, mu, epsilon, nu, and then our endings. These are our endings for the present middle passive participle. And the good news is we've seen all of these before. In fact, these endings are almost identical to the endings of the definite article. With that in mind, it's not so much learning a new set of endings as learning to recognize when we have a verbal stem plus this insertion men, as in legomenos. We have three keys to look for when it comes to the participle. First of all, we want to look for a verbal stem, that is something that looks like one of our verbal vocabulary words. Second of all, we want to look for our adjective endings, which in many cases are identical to the definite article. And finally, we want to look for men, which shows us that it's middle or passive present participle. To conclude this lecture, I want to take a look at some of the ways that the participle is used. And the good news is many of these ways are exactly the same as we use adjectives. The verbal flavor of the participle changes them a little bit, but the basic construction is the same. In the attributive, which is our quote-unquote normal adjective, we get the definite article plus the participle plus a noun. In the active, using our example word lego, ho legon logos is the speaking word. The word logos is doing the action of the participle. In the passive, the action is happening to the word. Ho legomenos logos. Very literally, we could say the being spoken word, but very often in English we have to make this into a relative clause. We say instead, the word that is spoken. And finally, in the middle, this peculiarly Greek construction, first of all, it looks identical to the passive, ho legomenos logos. But in this case, the word is doing the action to itself. We could say very literally the speaking itself word, or again, we probably want to convert it to a relative clause, the word that speaks itself. In the predicate, just like with the adjective, we have the noun plus the word is plus the participle, with or without the definite article. In the active, ho logos esten legon, that is, the word is speaking. The word is doing the action. In the middle, ho logos esten legomenos, again, in the middle, the word is doing the action to itself. The word is speaking itself. And finally, in the passive, identical to the middle, ho logos estin legomenos, the action is happening to the word. The word is being spoken. Notice that in this case, with is plus the participle, we have a complete sentence. The participle isn't so much describing the noun as it is completing a verbal thought. Finally, just as with the adjective, we can use the participle in the substantive use. This involves the definite article plus the participle without a noun. And remember, in English, in this kind of construction, we have to add the word one to stand in place of the noun because we don't like an adjective all by itself. The way this works is in the active, ho legon, the subject does the action. Ho legon, the speaking one. Again, in the middle, the subject does the action to itself. Ho legomenos, the one speaking itself. And then in the passive, the action is done to the subject. Ho legomenos, the one being spoken.